will never be an enemy of progress, and I love me some Viola Davis. I love me a good Black movie, and The Woman King was an excellent movie, okay? But I am not gonna lie, the part that had me like, oh, was when they kind of glossed over the fact that the Dahomey Kingdom and the Agojie warrior women were essential parts of the mass exodus of forced migration of Africans into the Americas. I mean, this is something that needs to be addressed and apologized for in the movie. So, like, I'm not an enemy of progress, y'all. I am not an enemy of progress or an op for the culture. But, you know, a lot of these things that the critics are saying are true. They're true. And us as Black people have to take accountability for that at some point. So the Agojie warriors were amazing women, strong fighters to be celebrated. But a lot of their military skill and aggression was used against Africans. And what did they do with a lot of the Africans that they kidnapped from other territories? They did not integrate them all into the Dahomey Kingdom. They did not, like, just keep it chill, y'all. They sold them in exchange for guns and liquor. And that is just facts. That's facts. So there's never a right or wrong side of history, which is interesting about Blacked Out. And I try to keep it as neutral as possible. But I do think that when we are watching movies like these and celebrating, we also have to put our thinking caps on. And my thinking cap is on. I love the girls. Go Agojie warrior women. But damn, oh my God, they did more harm in the name of keeping Dahomey a strong kingdom than they did, like, finding justice for Africans. Like, they could have used that aggression to keep Europeans away. I feel like more, like, kind of like how they mirrored it in the movie. But that's not really the true reality of the longevity, the long objectives of how these women were utilized. Do you get what I'm saying? What is up, my beautiful people? My name is Brittney Caldwell, and I am here to share with you history on all things super Black. So this series focuses on history stories that have taken place in Black spaces, Black events that have happened to Black people throughout the African diaspora. And when I left, I felt like I just had not really received all that I could receive. So I am re-gifting my knowledge and giving it to you beautiful people by providing you with videos on different topics every single Wednesday on Blacked Out History, y'all. All things Black, that history that we need to know, but we don't get fed mainstream. So if you're with the shit and you're loving it, or have suggestions of topics that you would love for me to cover, go ahead and hit that like button on this video, subscribe, and notify so we can vibe. So today we are actually talking about the Agojie warrior women of Dahomey. Yes, the Woman King just came out into movies starring these women, but many of the details were left out of the movie, of course, because why? Hollywood is Hollywood. So we all know that most movies that are based on true stories don't even really have the time or the ability to go deep down into the facts the way that we really need them to. And that is what yours truly, thank y'all. That's what I'm here to do today. So let's get into it. If I butcher words, just go with the flow and tell me how to say it. Don't judge. Dahomey was a West African civilization in what we now know as southern Benin today. The area was initially settled by the Fan people, which was an ethnic group around Nigeria, kind of, that still actually exists today. So they took residence in Abomey, around that plateau area, and decided that they wanted to centralize their power by choosing a king to rule over them. compared to like the smaller tribal leaders that they had at the time, right? Before like actual kingdom became a thing. So in order to really make yourself known as being powerful, to establish your actual kingdom as legitimate and sovereign, unfortunately, a lot of shit has to hit the fan for other people, right? So that's what ended up happening. They seized the Oyo Empire, the Songhai Empire, took down Mali Empire. Like the Dahomey Empire was really doing their thing at this time. They became really known as being the most powerful kingdom in West Africa during the 1700s and the early 1800s. And the truth is, it was due to the slave trade, which sucks. They stole a lot of land from these kingdoms, obviously, and then went on to steal their people. So unlike many African countries at the time, Dahomey had an absolute monarchy. What is an absolute monarchy, you might ask? Well, it's when there's a king or queen that is ruling that kingdom and does not have to answer to anybody, really, for the most part, right? There's no constitution that's set in place, really. There's no parliament that's accountable enough to like be able to check the king. Like the king has absolutely all the power. Legend states that Agoji warrior women were actually descendants of Queen Tasi, who ruled the Dahomey Kingdom in the early 1700s after the unfortunate and very sudden death of her twin brother, right? The first warrior woman who kind of led the pack, her name was Hongbe. Her father was King, I don't even want to try to say this name, y'all. King Bam. The first king to be chosen as the official leader of the Dahomey Kingdom. And her twin brother was King Akaba. So in 1708, her brother actually died following a really tough battle with some like unnamed long-term illness that was never historically specified. So Hongbe was like silently installed as the head of the military at that time. So after coming back from one of her first initial military campaigns, she was then publicly proclaimed as Queen of Dahomey. They entrusted her now that they could see what she was working with, and she used her power to really empower and encourage a lot of women in the Dahomey Kingdom at that time. So she encouraged them to take on roles that were kind of initially seen as mannish. Most women were learning how to work those farms by themselves, learn how to hunt by themselves, like learn how to really hold themselves down even when their man wasn't at home, you know, like independent Black women. But she reigned for only 3 years because she was actually removed by the throne. She was actually removed from the throne by her other brother. It be family sometimes, y'all. Sometimes it be your family who brings you down, but such is life. So that was the beginning of a rocky period for the kingdom of Dahomey. For the next couple of decades, they couldn't really keep a strong, consistent leader in power. They were like hanging on by a thread most times and just trying to keep it together. But this changed when they were overthrown by the great King Geza, right? Also known as that fine-ass man who was playing the king in Woman King. He's so fine. So that happened in 1818. He established power and would stay in power for about 40 years. So these were 40 very crucial years to the kingdom of Dahomey. He created a pretty like tightrope system for himself. He presided over all things religious and political. So at this time, they were still practicing even human sacrificing for religious ceremonies, and he was in charge of that. Politically, he served as the chair of the ancestral council, which is like similar to what we have as like the president's cabinet today, right? He was chief of finances, chief of trading. Like he had people around him, advisors, but at the end of the day, he made most of the he made most of the decisions at the end of the day, even though he had like people around him. So he did have governors within different provinces in Dahomey, because of course, as it grows, you need more people. But at the end of the day, he made a lot of the decisions. So he's known as the Woman King because he began to integrate female soldiers to be an official part of the army instead of like their own separate sector, which they had been before this time. Dahomey at this point is acquiring so much land and seizing so many territories at this time that there was like a high rate of intermarriage between them and a lot of the territories that they seized. A lot of integration of different cultures. So it was a very culturally diverse and pretty tolerant place. But like, unfortunately, if you got sold, you got sold. So it was important for them to be very organized centrally for war and expansion so that they could keep expanding. So him having like a pristine, top of the line army was very important because they were also depending on the capture of these slaves to keep them rich. I mean, it's a very complex topic to cover historically because there's not really any defensive historiography that explains the side of the African traders. You know, most of the written history is extremely Eurocentric and based on their viewpoint. So we can't really hear the African defense. But in my heart of hearts, I would like to believe that the leaders in Dahomey just felt like it was like kill or be killed, sell or be sold. You know, I can't really fully agonize with them all the way. And I would hope that they knew nothing of like the chattel slavery that my ancestors would later go to. But slave trading was just really big for this dynasty. And they were selling these slaves really mostly for exchange of like weapons, food supplies, rum, luxury, and all these things. So the Agojie warrior women were key in capturing and selling many of the slaves that would be sold into slavery. Many of the Africans that would be sold into slavery. Let me not say slaves because they were not slaves until they became enslaved. So they weren't just walking around being called Agojie warrior women by their peers either. They were often called Minos, which means like mothers, or Ahosi, which means king's wives. It was Europeans who came and gave them the name like Amazon warriors, Dahomey Amazons, because they believed that they really were like giving goddess almost. They were not used to seeing very muscular, built women, powerful, godlike grace. Like it was really majestic to them, which is why they kind of like aligned them with that Greek mythology of an Amazonian woman, right? There isn't much record on which king implemented the use of warrior women to protect himself. Geza made up an integral part of the Dahomey military and used them for his personal use. So during his reign, there were several thousands of women soldiers trained at a higher rate than had ever been before. And they counted for 40% of his actual whole army. He recruited women and men soldiers from the lands that he held captive. But there was also recruitment taking place from free, just average, regular Dahomey native women who would train from the age of young girls, like as young as 8 years old, literally. So some women were even like enrolled involuntarily by their husbands and fathers. Like if you felt like you just had like a bad wife or like a bad daughter, literally you just want her gone. Like, you're a king. I think she would look like a good warrior, like that type of vibe. Just like, wow, like, oh, what a betrayal. But I can't lie, like, say I was stolen from another territory or something, I would rather be an Agojie warrior than like just like an average slave or be sold into slavery over West. I mean, like, sign me up. Where is the list? Right. So in the movie, their life actually looked pretty lit. Like spa days, like a little happy hour session going on. I don't really know. So anyways, they were expected to be the most focused and aggressive women that they could possibly be. They were not allowed to get married. They were not allowed to have children. They were not allowed to have sex. Many remained virgins. Technically, they all had one husband and one husband only, and that was the king. Okay? They spent most of their days exercising intensely, learning survival skills. They were trained to not accept pain mentally. Like, don't let it defeat you. They were trained to not fear death at all. Like, these were the expectations, but I'm sure like some of them were probably being a little sneaky link here and there. Like, or they had to be pretty sexually fluid with each other, maybe. I mean, like, I can't personally imagine not engaging in sex for my entire life. But I don't know, maybe that's why they were really successful during fighting, like all that aggression, like sexual aggression from not getting laid. Honestly, I don't know, who knows. But anyways, the training was really intense. There's accounts of them being trained to go through like thorny bushes barefoot, like, and they had to not cry. Like, you didn't make it through crying. You had to not cry. Like, these women were so strong and well trained that oftentimes they were sent to war ahead of the men. So this worked as an advantage for them when they were fighting, this worked as an advantage for them when they were fighting, particularly when they were fighting Europeans, because they didn't act fast to kill when they saw like girls coming, like young women. So being a female warrior was a prestigious title. Like, don't get it twisted. These were very progressive and self-fulfilled women who felt like this traditional woman lifestyle that most of the women around them were living at the time was just not necessarily for them. No one was forced to be a warrior. None of them. They all chose it, and they had to choose it to be accepted. But they did have a lot of luxuries and clout that came along with being an Agojie warrior, right? Minos were generally very wealthy. They held high status in the community. They were really well taken care of by their king. And they actually lived in his compound with him and had access to like a lot of the luxury tobacco and alcohol that he was getting in return for the slaves that they were trading. Some of them even had slaves of their own to make sure that their immediate needs were taken care of and that they were cooked for and cleaned for. So the kings weren't really like reported to have any sex with any of them because, again, they were supposed to be celibate. But he did like treat them all kind of emotionally like his wives, which is a pretty big privilege to have at that time. Male searchers were not allowed to live around the king, though. He did not trust the guys, but he did have like a wing there for the women. So they had different sectors of Agojie soldiers. Some were hunters, some were trained to work. Some were hunters, some were trained to work with rifles and combat, some were trained with spears and swords, some were reapers. They were really advanced when it came to weaponry. A lot of the times, a lot of their spears and arrows would have poison on the end to kill their enemies quicker once it inserted their bodies. Gunners were trained to use the army's artillery of guns that had been sold to them by Europeans, like top-notch, latest technology guns. There's plenty of documentation on what Europeans thought of these women, with many claiming them to be like overly masculine and very, very feared. Jean Boyal, a French naval officer who visited Dahomey in December 1889, actually watched a teenage girl training for soldiership and being like tested for her final time. Her name was Naniska. So he wrote, brought before her a young prisoner who sat bound in a basket. She walked jauntily up to him, swung her sword 3 times with both hands, then calmly cut the last flesh that attached the head to the trunk. She then squeezed the blood off of her weapon and swallowed it. She had never killed before. This was her first kill. So the movie Woman King was actually based on the Agojie warrior fight against the Oyo Kingdom, in which was like having issues with them. It all started in 1823 when the actual wars between the two African nations began to take place. So I'm not going to spoil the movie too badly for those who may not have watched it. But by the end of the war, Dahomey had won and they kept expanding their nation after this, right? So in 1840, the Atlantic slave trade began to come to a halt when the British banned slavery within like the transatlantic area, right? So during this time, King Geza was in charge and he was not feeling this. Like Dahomey was making money off of selling slaves and he did not want to stop even after he had been sanctioned and told by Europeans not to. So slavery in Dahomey was not similar to the westernized American chattel type of slavery that we are all conceptualized to. Slaves were given the chance to be freed in Dahomey after the death of their masters, and their offspring also were not automatically born into slavery, right? So he just didn't feel like it was that serious, but it was. And this was the beginning of the end for the kingdom of Dahomey in several ways. The British Army, of course, didn't back down and accept the fact that the king did not want to stop trading. The British Royal Navy put up like a blockade and patrols against Dahomey to ensure that they would stop slave trading, but it did not happen. They tried changing their economy to focus on agriculture, produce, palm oil, and all these things. But it just wasn't bringing in the amount of cash that the king was used to having. Biographer and historian Martin Meredith quoted the king telling the British, "The slave trade has been the ruling principle of my people. It is our source of glory and wealth. Their songs celebrate their victories, and the mother lulls the children to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery." I mean, he basically just gave no fucks, to be honest. So at the end of the day, money equals power. The kingdom was losing money. When they failed to successfully annex a neighboring kingdom of Abeokuta, it kind of just like exposed their weakness. Like their power's going down. At this point, Britain's on their ass, right? So now the other nations can kind of see the growing influence that Europeans had on the kingdom of Dahomey and in that area in general. Britain was supporting other nations and even the French who were preparing to infiltrate Dahomey permanently, right? So between 1863 and 1865, the French began making their presence known in the Benin area. It placed Porto Nova under French rulership, basically, named it an official protectorate of France as well. So negative relationships began to grow between Dahomey and the French very quickly because they just could not reach even an agreement on who owned this port, who owned that port. Okay, slaves can't be sold in this port. Dahomey's still trying to sell slaves. They want control out of all the ports. France wasn't having it. Like, it was a whole bunch of cat fights almost over different ports along the coast until 1892 when the bottleneck broke and it was a wrap. So by this time, King Geza was like dead, right? and the new king, Behanzin, was ruling. He declared war on the French in 1892, and it was honestly the dumbest thing he possibly could have done. The Dahomey army, including the Agojie warriors, stood no chance against France, right? So the new king at this time, Behanzin, took flight and he left the kingdom, setting on fire most of his like royal palaces on the way out. And this just really marked the beginning of the end of the kingdom of Dahomey as they knew it. This ended really badly for Dahomey and the people, and especially our loved and glorified Agojie warriors. So in one of the battles against the French in 1892, it's said that only 17 out of 434 Amazon warriors who showed up left, right? They fought like several battles with the French here and in between, but this one was just really, really bad. The women were the last out of the whole Dahomey army to surrender, and a lot of the survivors even took on revenge by the French by like acting like just normal Dahomey women who were around and acting like they wanted to sleep with some French officers, waiting for them to fall asleep and then cutting their throats, beheading them, killing them with their own bayonet guns. Like, they did not give up a fight for their kingdom until the end. And they were praised really in a lot of European writings for their tenacity, right? A lot of people wrote that they were like warriors, fighting with extreme valor, always ahead of other troops, outstandingly brave, well trained for combat, and very disciplined, but they just did not stand a chance against the machinery that the French came with, especially with Britain backing France, right? Many of them died rather than being held captive by the French too. They would fling themselves at bayonets on purpose, like just trying to be brave if they knew that they were about to die. So the king was later arrested and deported to Martinique, taken to Algeria, and executed. After his death, his remains were returned to the capital of Dahomey, Abomey, and he is still buried there today. So basically, at the end of it all, the French declared the entire kingdom as a protectorate. It started off with that little port, and then it went to the whole kingdom. In 1904, the kingdom will become a full French colony, making it like a prized beginning piece of the scramble for Africa. So you may be wondering, what's the difference between a protectorate and a colony? Well, a protectorate at first is like baby steps to colonization. It's just like you put a state under the protection of the bigger country in exchange for like their goods, their services, resources, things like that, right? So they're offering them really protection from other bad countries when really it's a big oxymoron, right? They're just really providing physical protection and political stability, but allowing that said territory to still have its own sovereignty. But when a colony comes into play, that territory now is under the complete rule and sovereignty of the overruling country who is taking advantage of them. So for instance, Kenya was colonized by Britain for many years under direct colonization. It was a British colony. Sierra Leone was a British colony until they fought for independence on their own. But you have countries today that are just getting out of protectorateship, like Barbados was a protectorate of Britain for many years. Until just recently, they denounced all involvement with the Queen and the British crown. I mean, and it just so happened that she died shortly thereafter. God, rest in peace, whatever. So anywho, back to Dahomey. Despite all of their efforts and training, it just was not enough. They became French Dahomey, a colony, 10 years later, not gaining their own independence until 1960. So then they became the Republic of Dahomey. But in 1975, it got changed to the Republic of Benin. which is the country that we acknowledge and respect to have sovereignty today. So the Dahomey warrior women were largely forgotten in history until recently, making an appearance in Black Panther. That's the first time we saw them on the big screen, where they were like highlighted for their skills in war. And now they have like their own time to shine with the movie The Woman King. And their strength is being praised to the masses. And they deserve it. I mean, these queens definitely deserve it. But you have to ask yourself, what were they fighting for? What were they really fighting for? So today in Benin, the government is planning to build 2 museums that are dedicated to the slave trade with a partnership with the Smithsonian Institution of the United States. So in places like America and many parts of South America, we have had to like bury our heads in the sand, put our tails between our legs, acknowledge the cruel realities of slavery and how, you know, it's really internalized life for minorities and Africans of the diaspora up until today. And a lot of West African nations are beginning to take these steps, but really Benin and the Kingdom of Dahomey holds such a large part of this disgusting piece of history. And it's really complex and hard to acknowledge, right? So for over 200 years, Dahomey sold slaves to the Portuguese, to the French, to the British. Like, many of these slaves were men, women, mothers, nurses, doctors, kings from other empires, you know? And not all West African countries continued with this, but the Kingdom of Dahomey is really, really responsible for continuing this slavery even past its being deemed illegal by Britain, the key enslaver. Like, it's actually really crazy. So just recently, the president of Benin is shown to have visited the city of Baltimore and went to a church and like got down on his knees and was like really sobbing and admitting how awful this reality really is and how sad he felt looking at the African American lifestyle today in America, and that he wept on behalf of his country. I do think that Woman King is a great movie. I acknowledge that these fierce Agojie warrior women need to be like revered in history and really just like uplifted. And it's a beautiful thing when we have women empowerment, but we also have to ask ourselves, what exactly were these women fighting for? You get what I'm saying? And it's a very complex history because, as I stated, a lot of our history is not recorded from our viewpoint because a lot of African history is orated. It's oral. A lot of these things are stories or, you know, hidden. Who knows? Honest to God, because it could be written and hidden. But a lot of the written aspects of slave trade and slavery are accounted for greatly by Europeans and white onlookers versus hearing it from the cattle's mouth itself, right? So like, I am definitely not a stan of people who are like, well, Africans were selling Africans and Africans were selling Africans, because we also have to take into account that if you have a whole bunch of white people coming and they want slaves, they've stolen all of the slaves off of the coast that were living on the coast, or many of the Africans who were living on the coast have probably ran into the interior. Would you rather just take them, people, to the coast so that they don't have to infiltrate the interior? Or would you rather like fight them and just keep them at the coast? I don't really know. There's no right. There's no wrong. So I do not agree with the glamorization of the Kingdom of Dahomey. And I do think Woman King kind of skipped over the actual historical evidence-based truth of the subject. So in the movie, she was like, oh my God, no, we've got to stop selling our brothers. Like, this is not right. But in reality, they continued to do it even after it was deemed illegal by Britain. And that is just a fact. The kingdom did not stop selling enslaved Africans from other territories that they had taken over until they were bought down themselves. Until France brought them down, they did not stop stealing Africans and selling them into slavery. So that is the history of Agojie warriors, the kingdom of Dahomey, the transition of African ownership of forced diaspora of Africans into the New World and throughout. And I would love to hear what you guys have to think about this. Did I miss anything or get anything wrong? Do you have any suggestions for what you guys want to talk about next? Hit me in those comments below and let's really chat about this. Thank you guys for watching so much. Make sure if you are not liked and subscribed, go ahead and do that now. Y'all are always a vibe, forever. Love each and every one of you. And I will see you next Wednesday with Blacked Out History with Brittney.